Hello and welcome. This webinar is hosted by National Farmers Union, and it is the first in a series of webinars that are going to be hosted by Erbin Crowell from the neighboring Food Co-op Association. The purpose of this series is to share more information about NFU's cooperative legacy, encourage involvement in co-ops, and to answer your questions about co-ops. Throughout this session, we encourage you to share your ideas on future webinar topics in the chat function. Erbin, if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. My name is Emma Lindberg. I am the Education Director at National Farmers Union. I also serve on the Board of Directors of the National Cooperative Business Association. Joining me is NFU's Education and Outreach Coordinator, Charlie Michael. Before Charlie joined Farmers Union, he worked on an orchard in Palisades, Colorado. He now assists with our food safety and co-op projects. Charlie and I are going to be your moderators today. Our host, Erbin Crowell, serves on the Board of Directors of the New England Farmers Union and as the Executive Director of the neighboring Food Co-op Association, a cooperative association of food co-ops across the Northeast. Erbin received his Master's of Management, Cooperatives and Credit Unions from St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia and is the current chair of the Board of Directors of the National Cooperative Business Association. Next slide, please, Erbin. Thank you. Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to review some basic housekeeping. We will be taking time at the end of the webinar to answer questions, but you are welcome to enter any questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentation. To access the Q&A box, please click on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to connect with Charlie or myself, feel free to reach us in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please note that any questions you enter into the chat box can be read by everyone watching the presentation. All chats will be recorded, so if there are any unanswered questions, we will be able to answer them in a future webinar. We are recording this presentation and will post a copy for you to review at a later date. Next slide, please. If you are unfamiliar with National Farmers Union, our mission is to advocate for family farmers and ranchers through education, legislation, and cooperation. NFU is a grassroots organization, and we work on a wide variety of issues that affect American family farmers and rural residents. We would encourage all attendees to visit our website at nfu.org and explore the opportunities to become involved. Since our founding in 1902, we have been advocating for increased cooperative rights, and we have been committed to cooperative education and cooperative development. This is evident in our rich co-op history, which includes forming our first marketing co-op in 1903, supporting the Kaper-Volstead Act of 1922, and launching Central Exchange, which would later become CHS. We are currently headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we would love to know where everyone is joining us from, so please feel free to share your state in the chat box so we can say hi. And with that, I'm going to be turning it over to you, Erbin.
Thank you so much, Emma. Can you hear me okay? It's great to be with you here today. First, let me just thank you and the National Farmers Union for this opportunity. As Emma pointed out, the Farmers Union has a rich history in co-ops, which is how I became acquainted with your work, alongside my work in co-ops and food security and linking worker, consumer, and farmer co-ops across the cooperative economy. I hope this is going to be a valuable dialogue for you all. What I really want to try to focus on is the relevance of cooperative enterprise to the economic and social challenges that we face today, and the contribution they can help us make to a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. So as Emma mentioned, in some of my background, I'm chair of the board of NCBA CLUSA, also serve as executive director of the Neighboring Food Co-op Association, which is a second-level co-op of food cooperatives in the Northeast. Been a board member of New England Farmers Union for a number of years now, and really started my career in co-ops with Equal Exchange, which is a worker co-op and fair trade organization, and then transitioned into work with a variety of cooperative development organizations, before getting my Master of Management in Cooperatives and Credit Unions from St. Mary's University through the International Center for Cooperative Management. And all of that work brought me to being an adjunct lecturer at the Department of Economics at UMass Amherst. I wanted to give you a little sense of where I'm coming from. This is mostly just to share why I'm so enthusiastic about the cooperative model and how I came to a career in co-ops. I really learned about co-ops studying anthropology and looking at indigenous strategies for engaging in the global economy, and how indigenous communities were using the co-op model as a way to compete in the global economy. And that brought me to worker co-ops and the fair trade movement, which then brought me to an awareness of food co-ops and their role building the cooperative economy. And then to the rather inspiring and astonishing history of co-ops in the civil rights movement. And this is an image from a mural at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Training Center in Alabama. Ironically, back to an awareness that I shared a cooperative history with my grandfather, who it turned out worked in farm credit for his entire life, which is something I didn't really understand until much later in life. So, you know, a big part of why I'm passionate about co-ops is because they're not really present in our educational system. They're not really paid attention to in reporting on economics and business. And I think, you know, I'd like to make the case for why that's a problem. So in terms of this series, you know, I just outlined for today, I want to talk a little bit about the series. I've already talked about that a little bit, but for today, focus on the context for this discussion, a little bit of a look at co-ops in our economy, try to talk about what makes a co-op different and what they offer at this moment. And if all goes well, preserve some time for some questions at the end. And there may be some moments here where I rush through a couple slides to try to keep us on time, but we can always circle back to those at a later date. So just to reiterate some of what Emma said, this series is really building on the cooperative legacy of the Farmers Union, trying to remind folks of the importance of co-ops to rural America as well as across our economy, their relevance to contemporary challenges and opportunities, the importance of being engaged in cooperative policy, and hopefully all of this is going to contribute to, you know, stronger awareness and participation among Farmers Union members in their cooperatives. I think we're going to try to run a quick poll as we get to know each other, just to get a sense of whether and how people in this webinar are involved in co-ops. You know, please go ahead and pick any and all of the cooperatives that you're a part of, just to help us get to know who's on the call. And I'm going to keep moving while we do that. So for today's session, you know, obviously we're trying to raise some awareness about how co-ops have been part of the U.S. economy since its beginnings. Today, 1 in 3 people are members of cooperatives, and they enable people to provide themselves with everything from farm supplies to groceries, jobs, financial services, shelter, and electricity. But very few people in their educational experiences have had a chance to really explore and understand what a cooperative is, how it's different from other models, when they've been important in the past, and how they can help us build a stronger, more resilient community today. These are all questions we want to explore. I'm looking at the poll results. It's great to see so many credit union folks. I'm a member of 3 food co-op folks. I think I'm a member of about 5. I wish we had some utility co-ops in our region, but this is really great to see. Thank you for filling that out. So our context, now this is just my perspective, but I think it's important to share and sort of start the discussion here. We are looking at the largest recession since the Great Depression right now. We're seeing a dramatic increase in small business closures, unemployment and job instability, housing insecurity, hunger and food insecurity, climate change, deepening awareness of the challenges of systemic racism and economic inequality, and a real interest in alternatives. What are other ways that we could be running our economy? And for many of us, we might be asking ourselves, you know, wouldn't it be great if we had a business model that was based in self-help and participation, which was rooted in our local communities, was accountable to the people that it served, put common good before private gain, was more sustainable, was more equitable and democratic, was more accessible for everyday people, was flexible and innovative, and would it be too much to ask if it was actually tested and proven, something that had been demonstrated to be successful over time? And what struck me in studying the cooperative movement is how much our moment is so parallel to other times when cooperatives have been important, and specifically at the sort of early development of the cooperative experience. And a lot of people point to Industrial Revolution England, late 1700s, early 1800s, where you know, it wasn't just about industrial development. It was a huge dislocation of rural economies. It was an experience of globalization and impact on family farmers. You saw dramatic shifts in wealth, concentration of economic control, very limited political options, poor working conditions, food insecurity, impacts on environment and human health. This painting here is a picture of a coal fire at night in England, so you can see how the Industrial Revolution just had dramatic impacts. And it was also the birth of the modern cooperative movement. Specifically, people point to this group called the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. And this was a cooperative formed in 1844 in the north of England, a group of weavers, unionists, union activists, and community activists to form a member-owned grocery store. And this was a very modest store that was, its primary goal was to provide pure, affordable food to working people. But within its vision was actually the building of a cooperative commonwealth. And this small group of people with this very modest store, this is the store that's now a museum, created the principles for modern cooperative enterprise. I think it's important, particularly as we are coming off of Indigenous Peoples Day and considering the impacts of racism on our economy and modern reality, to recognize that while the Rochdale pioneers were in the north of England, what they were really doing is building on traditions of mutual aid that you find around the world, whether you're talking about indigenous traditions here in North America, systems of mutual support and group ownership in Africa and African American communities, lending circles in Latino communities, many of the group economic activities that we might be more familiar with in agricultural communities here in the United States, like land clearing, road building, harvest activities, even barn raising and quilting bees. These are all informal models of mutual aid that the Rochdale pioneers were building on. And what is particularly valuable about what they managed to do is they created a legal framework for an economic alternative. So while they were building on traditions of mutual aid and previous experiments, many of them failed in cooperative enterprise in response to the social and economic impacts of the Industrial Revolution in one part of the world, their advocacy for legal recognition of that model legitimized a way of working together, a business structure that could compete in other parts of the world as the Industrial Revolution expanded internationally. So very quickly you saw people in other communities adopting similar models as the Industrial Revolution and colonialism and imperialism and other impacts started to reach their communities. And not long after, the International Cooperative Alliance was founded in 1895 to unite, represent, and serve this movement worldwide. And today, you know, I think we can make the case for the relevance of cooperative enterprise and that it's a global movement. There's about 2.6 million enterprises with 1 billion members. That's more people than directly own stock in corporations. It's relevant. It employs more than 250 million people. That's more than multinational corporations. It's a distinct model with a unique history. It is an inclusive business model, empowering people with limited resources to work together and achieve scale and compete in the mainstream economy while still being democratic. It's a people-centered model rather than capital-centered, based on principles of one member, one vote. And it's flexible, so it operates in every sector of the economy across cultures, societies, and national boundaries. And it's successful and resilient, particularly at times of economic crisis. And this is something we can get into in a later session, but many people may remember it was in 2012, the United Nations declared 2012 the International Year of Cooperatives, because they recognized that during the global recession, cooperatives were not only surviving, but they were thriving and they were growing and they were continuing to serve their members while other businesses were failing. I think it's also useful to recognize how much co-ops have been part of the American experience, since its beginnings. Benjamin Franklin was the founder of an early cooperative that basically insured houses and businesses against fire. African Americans formed early mutual aid societies when other businesses would not serve them. In the early 1800s, agricultural co-ops, particularly in dairy, just grew exponentially in the United States. And you also saw a lot of really interesting experiments in cooperation that were based on social justice. So the Northampton Association of Education and Industry was actually a deliberately multiracial worker residential educational cooperative built on the foundation of a silk mill here in Western Massachusetts. And then you had groups like the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company, which was a worker co-op of African-American cultures, which at one point employed, I believe it was around 300 people in the membership of the cooperative. So the point there is it's been with us since the beginning and it's been relevant across our communities. And the ability of the movement to grow has really been supported by organizations such as the Farmers Union, which was founded in 1902 as the Farmers Educational and Cooperative Union of America. But there are also many other organizations at different places and times that placed cooperative development at the core of their work. And through their organizing, they were able to advance cooperative legislation, some of which Emma mentioned that the Farmers Union was directly involved with, that enabled farmers to work together and advance their interests in the face of highly concentrated control of the food system, right? And I don't think it can be overstated how important cooperatives have been to the ability of family farmers to compete. So much so that when you ask people about co-ops today, in my experience, most are going to talk about many of the very familiar cooperative brands that you find on the shelves in a grocery store. But I think you could also visualize co-ops in a different way. And we hadn't set up a poll on this, but maybe if anyone wants to mention in the chat what they think this might be a map of and why it's relevant, I'm going to watch for 15 seconds. Any guesses? Seeing any come across? So this is a map of the electrical grid of the United States. Yes, rural electric. Thank you. Electric co-op coverage. There we go. So co-ops provide power to more than half of the U.S. landmass. And I think that fact in and of itself just speaks to the incredible power of this model and its ability to enable people of limited means to come together and meet those needs together when investor-led enterprise, or even sometimes the state, was not able to or willing to serve those communities. And today, more than half of America's family farmers are members of a co-op. CoBank is one of the largest providers of rural credit. It's a cooperative that's part of the farm credit system. And mutual insurance, many of those insurance mutuals that you might recognize, like Nationwide, were pioneered by rural communities to meet their insurance needs. And today, the National Co-op Business Association recently released an update on the impact of co-ops in the US. So as I mentioned, 1 in 3 Americans are members. There are about 65,000 co-op establishments, and $650 billion in revenue, and $75 billion in annual wages. The other thing that's really exciting that's happening right now is the level of innovation going on in rural communities in response to contemporary, needs and opportunities in the economy. And this is something we could dig into later in the series if it's of interest to folks, just looking at the options. I was actually part of a conference recently called Radically Rural, where we did a session with a group of people representing different sectors in cooperatives, just sharing the different ways that the model is being used now to support rural communities. There's a deliberate development effort with a lot of leadership coming from the Cooperative Development Foundation around home care cooperatives for seniors. Most of these are organized as worker co-ops, but they can also be organized as either multi-stakeholder, worker and family, or organized by families to care for seniors. A lot of electric co-ops are getting involved in rural broadband, just recognizing the gap that we have in terms of rural connectivity and how important that is for economies. There's a lot of regulatory challenges there, but many rural electrics are beginning to overcome those and delivering high-speed internet to rural communities. There's been an expansion in financial services, particularly as banks sort of consolidate and there's less and less branches in rural communities and move online. Credit unions are starting to expand into rural communities they didn't serve before. Clean energy, whether you're talking about electric co-ops investing heavily in wind and solar, or worker co-ops that are actually doing installation and maintenance of home clean energy technology. Housing co-ops have become really important, particularly during this crisis. And there's a group here in the Northeast called Rock USA that's particularly focused on helping residents of manufactured housing purchase the land that their homes sit on, which can often be owned by outside investors or other interests whose goal there is nothing wrong with it, but their goal is to secure a profit. Whereas if the residents own it, it's to ensure that they have a stable shelter over time, right? Food security has become really important. Most of the members of my association are actually in rural communities and working to connect with producer cooperatives and other types of co-ops to increase food security. Platform co-ops for gig workers, who often have very temporary employment. This is sort of a new industry or form of cooperatives that's growing. Information technology, childcare. Business succession, I think, is both a very serious challenge and also a real opportunity for our cooperatives. I mentioned the number of small business closures due to the economic impacts of the pandemic. It's important to mention that sort of wave of business closures was already growing due to what people often describe as the silver tsunami. Sole proprietors looking toward retirement and often closing their businesses instead of finding a way to pass them on. And so there's a very exciting wave of co-ops that are built around either the workers in those businesses or the consumers or farmers actually purchasing those businesses that they depend on and ensuring that they operate over time. One of the challenges that I feel like we have with all of these innovations is co-ops are a very unique form of group entrepreneurship. Our common sort of understanding of what an entrepreneur is in sort of business literature and how we think about business in the US is very much about the individual who comes up with a great new idea and that business grows and they're able to cash out by selling that business. And innovation and entrepreneurship in a co-op is a very different kind of approach, right? It's no less innovative. It's no less risk-taking, but it's built on the participation of the people who will benefit from that business over time and over generations, right? It's not a model with a horizon where you sell off. It's meant to build infrastructure over time. And so I actually often use the term co-opreneur or co-opreneurship as a provocative way to think about how this is a different approach to business that doesn't really fit into the models that we usually learn about. And here's a great example right here, Putney Food Co-op in a small rural town here in Vermont. It was founded in 1941 in response to the Depression, and still growing strong as a small community grocery store. But all of that was kind of getting ahead of myself, because part of what we want to try to get at today is getting into a little bit of what a co-op is and what makes it unique. You know, is a co-op a form of mutual aid? Is it a legal structure? Is it part of a complex social movement? Is it a more competitive business model, an alternative to corporate globalization, or is it all of the above? And in the course of my teaching undergrads, where students have had very little experience with analysis of cooperative enterprise, I try to give them a few perspectives on what a co-op is. And there's certainly an angle of writers who really talk about co-ops as an outgrowth of cultural evolution, right? There's one vision that sort of says the way that human society has advanced is through competition. And there's another that says, actually, the way that we've had the success that we've had and expanded across the entire globe is through cooperation and collaboration. And so these authors see the cooperative enterprise model as an outgrowth of that sort of cultural approach to collaboration and cooperation that then has implications for the types of business structures we use, right? If our evolutionary roots are in collaboration, then corporate workplaces built on competition may not be a good match for actually where our success emerges from. And what I ask my students is, is this a compelling argument? Do you buy this argument? And if so, why is the investor-owned corporate model not only seen as dominant, but often seen as the only option? I also share with them, more sort of progressive perspectives on cooperatives. And this is an article from the New Internationalist magazine, which actually is itself now a cooperative. They converted a few years ago from a nonprofit to a co-op. And their focus is on the role of co-ops as an economic alternative, sort of a progressive innovation model for innovation and fair trade, how empowerment of marginalized communities, and development of innovative new industries. And they also point to the problem that co-ops have these ideals, they have values and principles, but they also have to survive in the real world, which means they have to compete with mainstream industries. They have to think about price, right? They have to think about service, not just their social purposes. And that can be a very difficult balancing act. And it's also often where you see critiques of cooperatives come forward. Oh, that co-op is too large. That co-op behaves too much like a corporation. And it sort of raises the question around, what are co-ops doing well? What are they not doing well? And who's actually responsible for those successes and failures if they are member-owned and member-controlled? Recently, and a lot of these writings have come out around the time of the Great Recession, there's been a sort of wave of business literature that seems to have suddenly discovered the cooperative model and recognizes that not only they're more financially successful than people might assume, but their actual value comes from their connection with their core stakeholders, with the communities that they serve. Whereas in a lot of literature, business literature, the focus is on maximization of value for investors as the driver behind business growth and economic success. This literature is starting to recognize that it's actually the linkage with the membership that is the driver of success. And interestingly, you start to see evidence of this in the way that many mainstream corporations try to mimic co-op behavior or messaging, right? You'll see, I think it was just recently, I saw a Walmart ad talking about a membership program in Walmart, right? So they recognize that consumers want to be part of something. They want to feel like they are connected with this entity, which in reality they don't really have a connection with because they've seen the value of that model around them in cooperative approaches to economics. And then we start to focus in on, okay, what are the definitions of cooperatives out there? I mentioned the International Cooperative Alliance earlier, but since the time of their founding, they basically adopted the principles developed by the Rochdale pioneers. An important dialogue that I feel like we're having right now, which could be another session here, is how these principles have evolved over time. There's sometimes an assumption that this identity was the Rochdale identity, when actually it wasn't. The cooperative identity of the International Cooperative Alliance has been amended 3 times historically, and it's been amended in response to what's going on around cooperatives in the economy and society and politics, and how co-ops can play a stronger role. But this definition from ICA identifies cooperative as a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise as sort of the core to what makes it unique. In many ways, co-ops are also sort of the origins of the socially responsible business movement. They're based in a set of values which go beyond social responsibility to self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And beyond that, these ethical values of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. One of the things that's exciting to me about the cooperative movement is this is not a certification, right? The cooperative principles are not something like organic certification where if you check every box, you're a co-op. They are more of a challenge to cooperatives. They are like guideposts to measure our success by. And I find that really valuable in the dialogues you see among co-ops on how well we are living up to these priorities and principles. Then the cooperative principles are defined as the way that cooperatives put their values into practice. So through voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information is a really interesting principle, particularly when you think about legislation. I think the current Farmers Union policy actually calls on co-ops specifically to allocate a certain percentage of their surplus to education. And in some states, that was actually the law. Like if you incorporated as a cooperative, a certain portion of your surplus had to be allocated to education. That's something that slipped away quite a bit, which I think is unfortunate. But nonetheless, co-ops continue to invest heavily in education and training of their membership so they can be effective participants. Cooperation among co-ops is often, from my perspective, misinterpreted as co-ops just being nice to each other and sharing information and when it's convenient doing business with one another. But if you dig into the principle and read more deeply into the guidance notes, it's really about association. It's about federation. It's about many of the structures that the Farmers Union knows well, right? There's strength in numbers, and cooperatives need to work together to influence policies around them so that they can serve their members better. And then the final principle, concern for community, is an effort to make sure that co-ops aren't only concerned with their own members, but are also concerned about the community as a whole. As I mentioned, co-ops have also been very important to rural policy, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a whole section devoted to cooperative development, and their own definition, I think, is also helpful. Co-ops are user-owned businesses that are controlled by and operate for the benefit of their members rather than outside investors. It's at this point in my course that I often feel the need to sort of try to sum up, and you can let me know if this is helpful in terms of understanding what makes a co-op unique. But what we're really talking about in this series is co-ops as an incorporated business model that's jointly owned and democratically controlled by its members or patrons. And that's an important distinction. It's the people who actively use the business to meet their needs and goals. Any income left over at the end of a fiscal year, what's called surplus in a cooperative, conventional business might call that profit, is then either reinvested in the enterprise to serve its members better, or distributed to those members in proportion to their use of the business rather than the capital that they hold. So in some ways, I started out saying this is a very straightforward, conventional business model, right, that's been with us since the beginnings of our history. On the other hand, it's a very radical model. It's a very different approach to business. So what I wanted to do is run through a little bit, and I'm hoping I'm not restating things for folks on this call that may already know this, but so what do we mean by use or patronage? We're talking about their economic relationship of the member to their enterprise, their purchases of products and services, the volume of product that they have processed, sold, or marketed, or in a worker co-op, the labor they contribute. And what's always been really compelling to me about the co-op business model is how flexible it is. So you can organize a cooperative around a whole range of purposes, for employment, to secure products, services, or shelter you can't get otherwise, to produce a product together, process and add value to raw materials, which has obviously been very important in farmer cooperatives, and then market those products or services as value added. You can also think about that flexibility in terms of industry. So while each of us might be most familiar with the cooperative we are a member of or work within, they actually also reach all across the economy. From agricultural co-ops, fishing co-ops are very important to small fishermen, food cooperatives, worker co-ops, artisan co-ops, housing co-ops, credit unions, small business co-ops, utilities co-ops, health and insurance, anything you can do with another business model, you could do using the cooperative model. You can also organize the model around the interests of different stakeholders. So worker co-ops, the members are the employees in the business. Consumer co-ops, the members are customers. Producer co-ops, producers. Housing co-ops, they're the residents of a building or a community. Purchasing co-ops are generally small business owners. Then you can have secondary co-ops, so cooperatives of co-ops. And you can even have, just to make things really simple, multi-stakeholder co-ops where you have different classes of stakeholder. And this is something that's much more common in Europe and other countries. But it's a very interesting model in terms of strengthening the support and interest of different stakeholders within the cooperative who might feel left out otherwise. Co-ops can also just be adjusted to any type of scale that you want. So it enables people with limited financial, political, or social assets to aggregate those resources, control them democratically, reach scale, and compete with much larger economic and social actors. But they can be small worker and artisan co-ops with just a few members, all the way up to large multi-billion-dollar agricultural and financial enterprises. One thing that's common to them all is they use this basic structure that is unique in how it's circular compared to either sole proprietorships or investor-owned corporations, in that those people who use the enterprise, who work for it, who depend on it for products and services, then become the primary stakeholder, the primary investor, the primary governor of that enterprise. And it's this circular relationship, you know, in conventional business thinking, this sort of circular relationship doesn't make sense. It's a conflict of interest, or it undermines sort of that profit motive. But if you look at it from a cooperative perspective, it's the entire strength of the model, right? It makes your core stakeholder the controller of the enterprise and the primary beneficiary. I'm going to move past this one a little faster. This was meant to be some distinctions between investor-owned co-ops and even, investor-owned corporations and even nonprofits. But the point here is that the core purpose of co-ops is to meet member-defined needs and goals. They're based on a set of values and principles. Ownership is by members, meaning active users. and control is by those members on a democratic basis. And then distribution of surplus or profit is based on how much you use the enterprise. The principle is that the cooperative is intended to operate at cost, and any resources left over are to be shared with the members. And so the questions for us are, what are the implications of this basic model for economic growth and stability, political democracy, economic equality and equity, local economies, international development, sustainability, and community stability and resilience? I'm not doing too bad on time. So what do co-ops offer right now? This has been, I think, a really important dialogue at NCBA CLUSA recently. A couple of years ago, our board basically put together a task force to try to define what it was that we thought co-ops brought to the table at this moment in history. And where we settled on was the power of co-ops in building a more inclusive economy and society. Interestingly, sort of in retrospect, we never could have imagined how that vision became so relevant in the space of a couple of years with the what our CEO Doug O'Brien often calls the sort of twin pandemics of COVID-19 and this recognition of the challenges of systemic racism and economic inequality. The contribution of co-ops to building a more just alternative has never been more relevant. And we've been doing a lot of work with other organizations like the Erbin Institute to try to understand from an outside perspective what other observers see as the real contribution co-ops have to our communities. And this is a report you can download at NCBA's website that was put together by the Erbin Institute, which really focused on the strength of co-ops in terms of more open access for people with limited means, sustainability over time, a commitment to community and being rooted in community, democratic governance and empowerment, equity, diversity, and inclusion, providing financial security and advancement for workers. And it's important to point out this is not just worker co-ops. If you look at other types of co-ops and analyze them against mainstream corporations, you'll see workers tend to have more longevity, higher pay, higher benefits. There's always improvements we can make there, but the cooperative model tends to encourage people to think more holistically about who it is there to benefit. And finally, growth. In order for co-ops to reach, empower, and benefit more people, it needs to demonstrate a model for effective growth. Just a couple points to support this in terms of co-ops and resilience. This is a graphic from the Ontario Co-op Association that just did a study on how basically co-ops outlive other types of business corporations over time. And as you can see, after 10 years, 44% of co-ops studied were still in business, while just 19% of conventional businesses were. So because co-ops are community owned, they root jobs, wealth, and infrastructure locally. And because they're more resilient, those benefits tend to accrue to the community over time. They create a multi-generational asset for the community. You know what, I'm going to go through this quick just to say, I wanted to share an example from my own cooperative association, not just because it's my association, but because it's the one I know the best, and it also demonstrates impact in unanticipated ways. You know, a lot of people, when they think about a co-op, food co-op, they think about a small natural foods grocery store and don't really think about the impact that those co-ops have together. But so our 29 food co-ops are leveraging their shared experience and resources to start new co-ops. They're jointly owned by 152,000 members and generate shared resources revenue of $347 million. And they're pooling these resources for shared impact. So while the average cost of a member share in a food co-op is just $150, the average revenue is $12 million. And together, these co-ops purchased 93 million in local products, and they average 29% of total sales are local products compared to national grocery stores, which average just 1.8%. So you can see how these this very affordable access to member ownership can actually generate substantial impact locally. And it also generates impact for workers in ways that you might not expect. So our co-ops employ 2,350 people. More than 60% of staff are employed full-time, and over 65% of those employees are also members sharing in the ownership of their local grocery store. And then in terms of sustainability and long-term infrastructure, on average, our member co-ops have been in business for more than 30 years. And we have a couple, including, I think I saw Alan Reitz from Hanover on our call, who are over 80 years old. So when thinking about what co-ops offer to our current moment, they have an ability to develop local skills, assets, and creativity for community entrepreneurship. They can pool very limited resources for much larger community benefit. They represent a model for community ownership, control, and participation. Their focus on meeting needs before maximizing profit, when used correctly, leverages a different type of business behavior. They can build regional economic efficiencies. They're very difficult to move or buy out, even though that does happen, right? You have to find a way to convince the current membership that it's in their interest to sell this community asset. So they're better able to root wealth in our communities rather than speculative markets. Customer and stakeholder loyalty, poll after poll shows that consumers like co-ops, even if they don't know exactly what a co-op is. They're more likely to shop at one, they're more likely to buy co-op products, they're more likely to pay more for those products, and they trust them more. And co-ops have a low business failure rate and are long-lived. So, I whipped through those slides. What I'm hoping is people grabbed onto enough within those slides that they both might have questions or feedback, or also ideas on where we might want to go next with this series. And I think to help facilitate that dialogue, I was going to pass this back to Emma. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't move too quickly through those. Really welcome your feedback on how that worked as far as a webinar and how we can improve these moving forward. So Emma.
Thank you, Erbin. This was really great. And as we've said before, this is a series, so hopefully you all are going to join us for future topics. And so that we know what you all are interested in, feel free to throw ideas in the chat box, but also we have a poll that we're going to share right now of a few ideas that we've had, and we would love to hear which topics might be of interest to you all. And while we do that, if you also have any questions for Erbin, I know he's really eager to answer some of your questions about today's webinar as well. And we see some votes are coming in, so thank you.
While we're waiting for questions, did you want me to put up that next slide, Emma, or did you want to wait?
Do you remind me which one it is?
What's that?
Is that the slide about future events?
Yeah.
Yes. So let's go into that really fast while we wait for things to come in.
There you go.
Thank you. So NFU will be hosting another webinar this month titled How Black Farmers Reclaimed Economic Power with Cooperatives. That'll be on October 27th, and we hope you all are able to join us. You can find a link to register for that webinar on our Facebook page, and we'll also share it out in an email after this webinar. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that link. That email is also going to have a link to the recording for today's webinar as well, if you're interested in going back and rewatching any of this. So keep an eye out for both of those. And as we said, we're hoping to do another webinar with Erbin, and we're looking at December, so we'll keep you all up to date on that. But for now, I'm going to launch the poll, and it looks like everyone's really interested in how have co-ops contributed to other movements for social and economic justice. So, I mean, there's a little bit of love for all of these topics, so we're really excited to hear that. Everyone's interested in what we have planned, so we're really excited to continue this series with you all.
Great.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie because I think he's been collecting some questions from the audience today.
I just add one thing. Given that result, just really want to make a second pitch for this next webinar you have coming up. You know, one of the big challenges for the cooperative movement and sort of studying the movement is who writes those histories, what stories that we hear about, even what resources I have as a professor to tell the cooperative story. And this webinar you have coming up, Jessica Gordon-Emhart, has just been a real pioneer in reviving and sharing the history of co-ops in African American communities. Her book Collective Courage is just amazing. And Terrence Courtney at the Federation of Southern Co-ops will just have a great perspective on cooperative development in that association. So just really want to encourage people to take that opportunity if they can.
Very good. So I had one, I guess I'll just go ahead and answer this question myself. It came up in the chat, which was about the availability of the webinar after the event. So it'll be up on YouTube within the next couple days. And we'll get a link out to everyone if you want to view it. Erbin, one other kind of more technical type question that someone had was, there was a map back on slide 25. I think it was distribution of co-ops. So it was maybe the one right after the electric co-op map. And someone was asking if you could provide a source for that. I think they wanted to potentially follow up with a little more personal research.
Yeah, you can find background on that map definitely at the NCBA CLUSA website. But that particular one was generated through a joint project at the University of Wisconsin, basically trying to create a census of cooperative enterprise. And that's been a multi-year project. One policy advance that we've been able to accomplish over the last few years is getting back into the Small Business Administration business census, the option to check off cooperative when you say what type of business you are. So for a lot of years, co-ops were not even included in that basic business census. Yeah. And it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of data comes from this question that's been put back into the survey. But those are the two. I can also put in some links, direct links in the resources we send out after.
Yeah, great. You know, another question that came up in the chat, this one was pretty technical, and I think probably outside the scope of this workshop, but someone was wondering about where they can get more tax information specifically for co-ops.
Yeah, I'd be happy to pull together some information, but honestly, USDA's Cooperative Development Services, if you go to their web, you could even just do an internet search for USDA co-op tax treatment. And I think you can actually download a couple PDFs of some good information there. There is there's a national law firm called Dorsey and Whitney that we do some work with that has also published a pretty succinct book on tax policy that I could include a link in the follow-up just to download a PDF of that.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, hopefully that'll give that person everything they need on that front.
Let me just add that it's an excellent question, and I couldn't get to that in this presentation, but co-ops enjoy a certain tax treatment because of their structure, and it is specifically because they are member-owned, member-governed, and member-benefiting rather than benefiting outside investors, that they have a certain tax benefit. So it's very important, I think, for people to understand in the cooperative movement and in cooperative enterprise to understand where that tax treatment comes from, because it's very much dependent on the unique structure of the cooperative.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for that. I think I'll combine a couple questions from the Q&A here because I think there might be a lot of overlap. So one question was generally, what are some keys to successful co-ops? And then someone else was wondering specifically with the pandemic going on right now, are co-ops, continuing to prove resilient, or is this a situation where just everyone's really being hit hard across the board, regardless of their business structure?
So keys to business success. I mean, honestly, a lot of the keys are not that different from other types of business in terms of, you know, the industry that you're in, what's the opportunity, you know, marketing services, all those you know, basic contributors to business success. The advantage that co-ops really have that other businesses don't is this unique member-owned structure, and the fact that they have a unique relationship with a core stakeholder, and the degree to which they maximize that relationship, I think they have that much more of a chance of being successful. There was another slide in here I had to leave out because when you study business and co-ops, business literature is just full of different theorists and writers trying to figure out how to make customers be more loyal, how to make workers be more loyal, how to make investors be more loyal, right? And everything they talk about as the solutions edges up to the unique cooperative model, which is to make those stakeholders the owners and governors of the enterprise and develop a relationship with them, right? So they have a stake in your success. And that's the unique competitive advantage of the co-op. So the bottom line, I would argue, is understanding your cooperative structure and ensuring that you maximize its impact on your success. And then in terms of the pandemic, I guess I would argue it's kind of all over the map. How much of it's directly related to the pandemic versus trade policies and other issues is a very difficult thing to really analyze and understand. What I would say is co-ops have tended, because their purpose and their priority is not maximization of profit, to do things that don't make market sense, right? But do make sense for their members. So our food co-ops have invested heavily in things like curbside delivery, in ensuring that employees are safe, that customers are safe in ways that mainstream grocery stores didn't. Many worker co-ops, because their priority is to maintain employment, changed what they did in order to find work for their members, right? In our region, we have a design build co-op that works in architecture and ended up making PPE in their facility in order to keep people employed. Now, if your goal is maximization of profit, those things don't really make sense, right? But if it's to keep people employed, it makes perfect sense. So I think what would be interesting is looking at the ways that co-ops have behaved differently, in addition to whether they've been successful or not during the pandemic.
Well, that sounds good. I think we are about out of time here. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. Emma, any final closing comments, or anything?
Sure. Well, I thank you, Charlie, for asking questions, and Erbin, thank you again for being here with us today. We really appreciate your time, and for all those questions we didn't get to, there's going to be plenty more opportunities. Hopefully we see you all at the next webinar with Erbin and we get to answer them in the future. But if you would like to stay up to date on future cooperative webinars or learn more about farmers union programs in your state, I would encourage you to head over to nfu.org/join, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Emma and Charlie.
Bye, everyone.